Hello, this lesson is for section 12-6, day 3. What you're doing is solving more complicated quadratic equations. It's very similar to the day 2, except they're just a little bit more complex. What you're trying to do in all of them is you're trying to get the variable x all by itself. So you're going to solve it just like a normal equation. Half the answers you're going to have to round to the nearest tenth, and half of them you're going to have to put in simplest radical form. So make sure that you're reading the directions. So in this first one, 5x squared equals 90. We're trying to get the x all by itself. So the first thing that we want to do, this is 5 times x squared. We want to get rid of the 5 by doing divide by 5 and divide by 5. These cancel out, so we bring down the x squared, top divided by bottom. 90 divided by 5 is 18. Remember, the opposite of taking the square of a number, the opposite of squaring a number is to take the square root of a number. Remember, the square root button on your calculator is one of those blue functions. It's over to the left-hand side, right above the x squared, so you got to hit second and the square root button to change it into a decimal. Anyway, the opposite of squaring a number is to take the square root, so we want to take the square root of both sides. Whatever you do to one side, you have to do to the other. So if we were leaving this in simplest radical form, this would be x equals plus or minus. Remember, you have to do plus or minus anytime you take the square root of a number. So it's plus or minus the square root of 18. 18 can be simplified. 18 is really, remember, you're looking for those perfect squares, like 4s and 9s and 16s and 25s. So 9 times 2 is 18. Cross off the 9, bring out the 3. So this becomes plus or minus 3 radical 2. So if we were leaving it in simplest radical form, your answer would be plus or minus 3 radical 2. If we wanted to change it into a decimal, you need to type in 3, second button, square root button, radical 2. And as a decimal, we're just going to round it to the nearest tenth. So x equals plus or minus 4.2. Again, half of your answers will be in simplest radical form, half of them will be in decimal form. In the middle one, trying to get the v squared all by itself, we want to divide by -5 and divide by -5. Those cancel out. V squared equals, top divided by bottom, v squared equals 9. Take the square root of both sides. Opposite of squaring is to take the square root. When we take the square root, this becomes just a v. Whenever you take the square root, it's plus or minus, so it's plus or minus. 9 is a perfect square, so it's just plus or minus 3. That would be your answer in simplest radical form and also decimal form. For the third one, we want to try and get that x squared all by itself, so you need to get rid of your minus 50 first. So plus 50 and plus 50. So x squared equals 50. Take the square root to get rid of the x squared. Square root of both sides, so x equals plus or minus the square root of 50. Now 50 can be broken down. 50 is really 25 times 2. Remember, we're looking for our perfect squares. Cross off the 25, bring out the 5. So in simplest radical form, this is x equals plus or minus 5 radical 2. That would be your answer in simplest radical form. As a decimal, type it into your calculator. 5 square root 2 and -5 square root 2. So it would x equals plus or minus 7.1 when we round to the nearest tenth. A little bit more complicated this time. We always want to try and get rid of the plus or minus whatever it is first, because you want to try and get that x squared all by itself. So plus 300 plus 300. Those 300s cancel out, so we have 2x squared equals 300. Divide by 2, divide by 2. X squared equals 150. Again, anytime you have x squared, you want to get rid of that squared by doing the square root. So we want to do the square root of x squared, which is x, square root of 150, which is plus or minus radical 150. 150 can be broken down. Again, we're looking for 4s and 9s and 16s and 25s. 25 goes into 150 evenly. 25 times 6 is really 150. So cross off your 25, bring out your 5. So x equals plus or minus 5 radical 6. That would be your answer in simplest radical form. You could just type in the square root of 150 if you wanted to, or you could do 5 square root of 6 to make it into decimal form, and to the nearest tenth this would be plus or minus 12.2. In this next one, be careful, this is a special example, pay close attention. First thing that we want to do is subtract 40 from both sides to get the x squared all by itself. So 0 minus 40 is negative 40. To get rid of these squared, we want to do square root, square root. Well, the square root of a negative number you can't do. All right, you can't take the square root of a negative number. So this is no solution. You could either write no solution or you could write imaginary. On class kick, make sure that you spell things correctly. It won't show up if you spell things incorrectly. So either write no solution or imaginary. Again, that happens because we have that negative number inside the square root symbol. Anytime you have a negative number inside the square root, it's either going to be no solution or an imaginary number as your answer. 2 more. These are a little bit more complicated. Now, you would be tempted to do distribute and distribute. We're not going to distribute. Remember, we're trying to get that letter all by itself. Well, the first thing that I see here is 2 times this whole thing. To get rid of the times, you want to do the opposite, which is divide. So we're going to divide by 2 and divide by 2. We're trying to get that set of parentheses all by itself. So we have now x plus 5 squared equals 20. Again, the opposite of squaring a number is to take the square root of a number. So the next thing that we want to do is take the square root of both sides. We're keeping those parentheses there for right now. So now by taking the square root, we're getting rid of that squared. So now we have x plus 5, you don't need to put it in parentheses anymore, equals plus or minus the square root of 20. Now here's where it gets a little bit tricky. When you go to solve the rest of this problem, you want to split it now into 2 separate things. All right? You could change that into a decimal if we're doing it the decimal way. You could simplify it right now. 5 times 4 is 20. Cross off the 4, bring out the 2. So this is really x plus 5 equals plus or minus 2 radical 5. This is where we want to split it. Now be very careful on class kick. I want the plus to go over to the left-hand side and the minus to go over to the right-hand side. If you do it the opposite way, your answers are going to be wrong on class kick. So now when we split the equation, we're splitting it with that plus or minus. We have x plus 5 and we have x plus 5. And now here's where it's going to be different. X plus 5 equals 2 radical 5, and x plus 5 equals negative 2 radical 5. Notice how we took that positive 2 radical 5, moved it over to the left-hand side, took that negative 2 radical 5 and moved it over to the right-hand side. Always move your positive 1 over here and your negative 1 over there. So now we have 2 separate things that we need to solve. To get that x all by itself, we would do minus 5 and minus 5. In simplest radical form, you can't do 2 radical 5 minus 5. 2 radical 5 minus 5 is just 2 radical 5 minus 5. That's your answer in simplest radical form. In simplest radical form over here, we're doing minus 5 and minus 5. So again, we can't simplify that anymore, so it's just negative 2 radical 5 minus 5. Notice our 2 answers. We have positive 2 radical 5 minus 5 and negative 2 radical 5 minus 5. If we are going to put it in decimal form, you just type this right directly into the calculator. 2 radical 5 minus 5. Make sure your minus sign is outside of the radical, not underneath the radical. When you do that, you would get negative 0.5 for this one, and you would get negative 9.5 for this one. Be careful, it's not just plus or minus the same number after we split them. That doesn't always happen. For the last one, again, we're going to try and get that x plus 2 inside the parentheses all by itself. We're going to try and get that negative 3. We got to get rid of the 10. Always get rid of, just like in solving a normal equation, always get rid of your plus whatever or minus whatever first. So we're going to do minus 10 and minus 10. So we have negative 3 times times x plus 2 squared equals 21 when you subtract. Now it looks just like this problem. So we're going to divide by -3, divide by -3. So now we have x plus 2 squared equals -7 when we divide. To get rid of that squared, we want to take the square root. So now we're going to end up with x plus 2 equals the plus or minus the square root of -7. The light bulb should be going off in your head right now. Uh-oh, negative number inside the square root. Because we have that negative number inside the square root, this is no solution. Solution. Or you could put that it is imaginary. Remember, anytime that you have a negative sign inside the square root, it's no solution or imaginary. Go ahead and do the class kick assignment. There are 12 questions. Again, when you split things like this, make sure your positive answer goes over to the left, your negative answer goes over to the right.